June 12, 2014, election night, and another night to forget for progressive Conservatives all over Ontario. The party went down to defeat for a fourth consecutive campaign. What's ailing this once proud dynasty, and what does the next leader have to do to turn things around? Let's get into this with Richard Ciano. He is the current president of the Ontario PC party. Rod Phillips, wagon master on the 2007 PC election campaign. He's going to tell us what that means. He's now the chair of Post Media and Civic Action. Robin Martin was a PC candidate in Eglinton Lawrence in the last election. David Kaplan, the former Ontario Liberal cabinet minister, and Marit Stiles, longtime NDP advisor, is here as well, and we welcome all of you to our little makeshift studio here in Leaside as we get into this subject. Before you can solve a problem, you got to identify what it is. So let's start there. Mr. President, to you first. Do you think Ontario Conservatives understand why their party has lost 4 straight elections?
Yeah, I right after the election, I did a fairly lengthy debriefing tour, I guess you could call it, with activists and campaign managers. Robin and Rod attended some of those sessions, and I certainly heard a lot of reasons why members and activists think we've been unsuccessful in the last few elections. The main one seems to come down to the disconnection between the policy development process and the policy that members come up with and activists come up with through, particularly this time, was a very intensive process, and what ultimately is put forward by the leader and the campaign team in the election. That seems to be one that was pointed out quite a bit to us.
Okay. Rod, what would you add to that? Oh, first of all, what's a wagon master?
The guy who makes the bus run on time.
Gotcha.
That's even 2007 when they used to have buses. We don't even own buses anymore. I think the party is really, the next 8 months are about figuring that out. I think it is about reaching back into what's worked, looking at what didn't work in the last campaign, but not just being focused on that. This isn't about being ready for 2014. This is about being ready for 2018. And so I think the process of selecting a leader, and through the various candidates and through all the activity that's going to go on, that's where the party will answer. Well, it'll ask itself that question and it'll answer it, and the answer will be the form of the new leader.
Robin, how long did you campaign for?
About 2 years.
How many doors do you think you knocked on?
Oh, I don't know, 70,000 or so, a lot.
And after doing all of that, you must have a pretty good idea of what the answer to this question is, do you?
Well, I agree with Rod that that's part of what this time is about, is figuring that out. I think it's important that people take the time to focus on that and not think about which leader first. So in that way, I disagree with Rod a little bit. I'm afraid if we rush to which leader, we'll be picking somebody who we think might have the right qualities without figuring out what exactly the qualities are that we should be looking for. So I think it's worth taking a pause and stepping back. I personally think, and I know a lot of people agree with this, that the overarching issue is communication and how we communicate. That sort of goes back to what Richard said. The platform, the policies in the election, how we communicate those things, that ends up being an issue for us, I think, in every one of those last elections that you were referring to.
David Kaplan.
I'm not sure I know why the Liberals won the last 4 elections. So, but more seriously, I think it's important that political parties, not just Conservatives, but they all evaluate in terms of the world has changed so much. I mean, Rod said, when we had buses, but that's not far off the truth. Everything is so electronic these days. We used to have these enormously long election campaigns, municipal ones notwithstanding, and now they're compressed into a small 1-month period of time. The way we communicate with people, but the vote coalition that we build. And I don't think Conservatives have figured out who that vote coalition is that can propel them into becoming the government in Ontario.
Marit.
Well, I mean, the difficulty is that when you're in the midst of a leadership race, your focus is on who's going to be the leader. And the people who pick that leader are the members of the party, not the voting public, And so I think that it is actually a kind of a difficult time for the party, because there are these big overarching issues which certainly have to do with the last leader in part, Tim Hudak, but also previous leaders who didn't actually form government either. And so I think as PC party members are looking at leadership questions right now, I totally agree. I think that you need to stop and pause and think about who we are as a party, and whether or not you're situating yourself in a place that's going to win you government to the next election.
There is a temptation, though, Richard, to say it was that last leader. He was lousy. He blew the whole thing. It's certainly not the party colors. It's not the platform. It's not the policy. It's not the communications. We just had a bad leader nobody likes. You hear that election after election after election.
Well, that's it. It's not good enough when you've lost 4 elections in a row under 3 different leaders. Clearly, you can't just point to the last leader and say that's where the problem is. But one thing that has been consistent has been that, well, that factor that I pointed out that members very much spoke about at our debriefings. This, again, that they were surprised by the policy that ultimately and the platform that the leader and the campaign team that were putting forward, just as they were in the last election when it came to the foreign workers and that type of thing in that election, just as they were with faith-based schools. There's this very strong sense among membership that there's a disconnection. They're not proud of what they're going out, what they're being asked to go out and campaign on, and that presents a serious problem. I also think there's been a phenomenon in our party as well where one or another, and I've talked about this as well at these debriefing sessions, where one or another sort of tribe in the party gets control of the leader of the day and says, this is the way you win the election.
What do you mean tribe?
Well, every party has its factions, let's put it that way. People that think the way to victory is one path or the other path, and they tend to be quite narrow in their view, and they tend not to want to include everybody in the party and creating a vision.
In your party, there's red Tories and then there's small C conservatives?
It goes beyond red. That would be that is one way of looking at it, but I think that's an overly simplistic way, truthfully, to look at it, Steve. It goes to even, you could go back to people that were running for leader in the 80s as to where some of these different factions formed. So it seems to be more diverse than that. Let me put it to you that way.
Right.
I think the issue is that, as you know, success doesn't breed excitement, or failure doesn't breed excitement, and so the four election losses, it becomes a smaller and smaller family, and some of those schisms that go back decades, you know, the Miller folks and the Timbrell folks, and you know, it comes out, and so I think that's why this next period of time is so important, because the fact of the leadership and how one wins one means there'll be more members coming in, and that brings fresh blood and fresh people, in addition to the folks who've been the stalwarts of the party, and those things that were so important when you have a small group. I think the point you made is, you know, you need to reflect the province to some degree, and the party today in its membership doesn't reflect the province.
David.
What I've always found very interesting, and kind of building on what Rod is saying, is that the Conservatives used to be the party of urban and the emerging Ontario, and the Liberals were the party of rural Ontario. And that really changed somewhere in that 1980s period, really beginning with Stuart Smith. Stuart Smith went to recruit candidates like Ian Scott, like Eleanor Kaplan, and then David Peterson kind of built on that and established stronger roots within urban and suburban Ontario. And, you know, the inheritors, Lynn MacLeod, Dalton McGuinty, picked up on that. The Conservatives gone almost the opposite direction. Bill Davis had built a juggernaut in Toronto, in urban Ontario, and Frank Miller, and then others really have looked to consolidate their bases in other parts of the province.
Your cell phone is ringing. That's hilarious. I don't think we've ever... Have we had that happen on this show before? I'm trying to remember.
Uh-oh.
Because Richard called him just now.
I'm pretty sure that was his mother. I'm pretty sure that was his mother, Eleanor Kaplan, saying, "Don't mention my name on the show." Anyway, pick it up, David.
I apologize, and Mom, I'm sorry. But the reality is that that's how the Conservatives had built their vote coalition and built their success for decades, and seemingly that's gone almost in the opposite direction.
I know Richard's quite right. It is a bit simplistic to say it's sort of the red Tories versus the more rural small C conservatives. But the fact is, those are the two, I think the fact is anyway, Robin, those are the two main overarching tribes, if you like to put it that way, in the PC party, and have been sort of fighting for supremacy within the party for a half a century. That's fair to say, isn't it?
Well, certainly there is a way of looking at it and analyzing it which says that. I don't really see that as being at all a relevant issue for the party right now. I think what the party, the factions that Richard is talking about, in my mind, are more people who are around various leadership candidates, if you will, their teams, which party members don't really get a say in who's on the team. And that may be the issue, that the team, once the leader is picked, the team sort of goes into, okay, now we're managing the leader's reputation, etc. And that, I think that can be the issue. I think what we need to do is make sure that we pick a leader who has a team that is maybe an open team, who is willing to take input and to go out and listen to people who maybe haven't been members of the PC party in the past and we would like to be members in the future, and talk to those people. And I think that that kind of an open discussion, not so much with the overarching red Tory and blue Tory, because I don't think those things matter. I mean, we lost a leadership race an election under John Tory. We lost an election under Tim Hudak. You could say that they are representatives of both sides of that spectrum, and I don't think that was the issue.
Fair enough, but yes, but for different reasons. You lost those elections for different reasons, and let me just, at the risk of ticking all of you off, go through a bit of a checklist here. 2014, you lost the election, I suggest, in large measure because of the promise to eliminate 100,000 positions in the public service. But if you go back, in 2003, Dalton McGuinty's first election win, there was that there was that comment about McGuinty that I guess a lot of people thought went over the line about the
kitten-eating aliens.
Reptilian,
I have the T-shirt, by the way.
Reptilian kitten-eating, whatever it was. 2007, it was the faith-based funding promise that obviously did not find favor. 2011, foreign workers, some anti-gay leaflet drops in Toronto, chain gangs. I mean, a lot of stuff that seemed to be sort of wedge issue stuff. Rod, does this party have to learn how not to shoot itself in the foot all the time?
To me, it gets back to what is a party for, right? What I see in all those examples in different ways is not feeling the pulse of what people want. So when we talk about the 100,000 jobs in the last campaign, there was a lack of connection to the economic insecurity, frankly, that is still resident in the province, and that the fact that was made a focal point said that we aren't in touch with what people are feeling sufficiently. And I think that's you could go at any of those examples and I think use that, but that's what a party is for. And it's got to be a functioning party. And I think there's been some of the comments that make sense about why it might not be functioning. And obviously the leader is one important part of that, but a party that's in touch, that understands the nuances of what's going on in all these communities, at least the ones in the electoral combination that it needs, but presumably across the province, isn't going to be making those kinds of mistakes over and over again.
Can you speak to this notion of parties shooting themselves in the foot all the time? I mean, these are the worst injuries in politics, right? The ones that you're responsible for doing to yourself. How do you avoid that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think some of it is just not being aligned with the voters. But the other thing is understanding who you're up against. Who is your adversary? And I think that, going back to the leadership race and where the party is right now, is a big question, because they're faced with a Liberal government that, albeit went into the last election on a very progressive footing, but is facing also now is going to be cutting $2 billion in public services. There's going to be a fire sale of public assets, and so this party, this is the talk, right? So where does this party also position itself in relation to that, and how in touch are they with the reality of Ontarians today? And I think part of the problem, as we were talking about earlier, is you get these little factions that come in to control the messaging and the communication, and sometimes they get it wrong. And in this case, I think they've gotten it wrong a number of times, and so they need fresh blood. They need, and also, at the end of a leadership race, they need to heal the rifts, because there will be rifts. There will be some divisions, and exactly, whoever comes in as the next leader needs to be welcoming of everyone and be the voice that represents a broader swath of that party.
Have Conservatives, Richard, had a particular problem, Ontario Conservatives had a particular problem coming together after leadership campaigns?
I think there's been some of that, and it's not, I don't think it's for lack of desire by the folks necessarily on the losing side. It's not that they're sore losers, as it were. I think some of it is sore winners, if you know what I mean. It's where, again, this phenomenon where it's like, okay, we got the person we want as leader, and now we're going to cocoon them, and we're going to control them, and we're going to keep everybody else who could contribute out. That's a little bit of what I've seen the last little bit.
But that's the nature of leadership politics, and it's not just the Conservatives. I'm sure in the New Democrats, I know for sure in the Liberal Party, that those kind of dynamics exist. There's hard feelings, there's divisions. These contests within the family are the most difficult because people get divided, and there are very hard feelings to develop.
That at least I know on the Conservative side would be, and exactly going back to the time where we had a great deal of success, would be Bill Davis. Did a very good job of reaching out to the Alan Lawrence people and bringing them in and building a much bigger and more successful tent for the party. And I think, again, that ability to, it's not that you want people who are on the winning side of leadership to be then, okay, you know, you dance with the ones that brung you in politics. I understand, everybody does, but you also build a bigger team and a bigger tent, and that's where it seems we've really failed as a party in recent history.
That's certainly what you need to do.
I didn't, for instance, in my case, I didn't support Tim Hudak in the last leadership. I supported another leadership candidate. I then, okay, we went through an election, we lost. I then put myself forward in perfectly good faith as a party president and to try and support. And even in that context, I was still excluded, really, as a party president from the campaign team and wasn't really invited to participate. And it just seems like that's something we really kind of pattern we've
Richard,
gotten into.
Why was that? Did they see you as potentially not being on the team?
That's right. That I just wasn't somebody that because I guess I wasn't an original Tim Hudak guy in the previous in that leadership. I couldn't be trusted or brought into the tent.
Let me ask the follow-up. Did you give them any reason not to trust you?
No, I don't believe I did. I really again went in with a lot of good faith and wanting to help. The last place you ever want to be, and let me tell you, in political life, is the president of a party where you don't get along with the leader. It's the last place you want to be in politics. It really isn't a pleasant place. So again, I thought everything I did was in good faith and trying to help the party and trying to help the leader of the day, but it just was never viewed that way.
Let me throw another theory on the table here, which is, and most people that I know who follow Queen's Park think this is a real thing. Thomas Walcom of the Toronto Star doesn't. So I put that out there in the interest of full disclosure. But it's not a coincidence that while Liberals have been winning election after election after election after election in Ontario, Conservatives have federally. And of course, we had decades and decades where it was always Liberals in Ottawa and Conservatives at Queen's Park. And I wonder, Rod, to you first on this one, do you need the Harper government to lose to change the dynamic to open up a possibility of a Conservative government winning at Queen's Park?
So I don't know if I hate to agree with Thomas Walcom and the Toronto Star, but I do. I do not. I think those are the kinds of things that after the fact people construct to explain what are much more complex. And it also is one of those things that makes you feel better when you're on the losing side because it's not my fault. It's my federal cousin's success. So I think.
It's funny how it always works out that way.
I think it misunderstands, at least today in 2014, what voters are thinking about, and some sense that they magically connect these two items, or have an intuitive sense of wanting to balance provincial and federal. I think there's other things at play that are far more important.
Okay, except that, David, I will tell you that in February of 2011, when Harper won his majority government after 2 minorities in a row, I spoke to, and the people in the Liberal campaign shall remain nameless, and they said, Harper won a majority federally? Whew, that gives us a shot, because you guys were in deep trouble at that point.
Well, if you look at the early part of the campaign in June, Kathleen Wynne ran against Stephen Harper, and this is a consistent theme. I mean, Bill Davis used to run against Pierre Trudeau for part of it because it's oftentimes hard to run against your opposition counterpart in the province of Ontario. You want to appear, sort of at an equal level with leader caliber individuals, and who better than the Prime Minister? So it's not surprising that politicians have used that dynamic for electoral gain for decades now.
Robin, what about it? If the federal Conservatives were to lose the next election, would that change the dynamic to open up some possibilities at Queen's Park for Conservatives?
I mean, it probably does have an effect on the dynamic, but I don't agree with the theory. I think I agree with Rod and Thomas Walcom, I guess, that it is kind of an ex post facto.
Killing both of you to say that, isn't it?
Rationalization. It is. I prefer to say I agree with Rod. I agree with Rod, but I think that is an ex post facto rationalization. And I mean, at a certain point, the federal government will change, and the provincial government will change at a certain point, and maybe those things overlap more often than otherwise. And I think for some people, they like to balance it ideologically. You do hear that from people at the door, that that's a consideration for them. But I don't think for most people.
Okay, Marit, let's try this. I think it's fair to say that the PC party has come to, part of its brand has come to be, we're not the party that likes government very much. In fact, we're the party that actively dislikes government. Is that a problem in 2014?
Well, I mean, it's worked for them in the past, right? It worked for them when Mike Harris was elected. It works for some conservatives, and I'm not saying Conservative Party, but like the Fords here in Ontario, who run in a kind of anti-government, anti-politics, anti-elite platform. But I think that for today and where we're at and the kinds of services that we've already seen cut back and the kinds of hurt that a lot of families are feeling in many parts of this province, I actually think that those services that government provides are more relevant today to many people. And so in that sense, I think that if you don't get that, then you're really missing part of the point. And so there is an opportunity here for the Conservative Party to maybe open things up a little bit, change their tact a little bit, and maybe appeal to more Ontarians.
Rod, does your party look like it hates government too much?
I think it does, and I think particularly as we are becoming more urban and suburban, there's a purpose to government, and that purpose becomes even more important when we all live closer together. I think some of the problems that that we're facing, there's a sense among people that there's a need for collective response to certain things, and the progressive conservative philosophy has always been this tension between, given that we need to do that, we also need to preserve individuals' abilities to pursue what they want to in their lives and be successful or not on their own basis. But I think we're in a period where people are seeing there's problems like transportation, gridlock, our infrastructure, our green spaces. These aren't things that any one of us can fix. So, there are bad governments, but government isn't bad.
David?
It certainly seems like Conservatives hate government and government workers. They don't want, from the last campaign, government workers to vote for them, which is kind of odd, given that the broader public sector is 1 million people and then all of their families and friends.
Of course, the flip side of that is that Conservatives think that you Liberals love public sector workers a little too much, and there's an unholy alliance between the two of you right now. Well,
we certainly admire and respect the work that they do and want to support them and feel that the services they provide in healthcare, education, and a whole host of other areas of community protection are very important to the day-to-day lives that we have. And so if that's a distinction, it's one that I'm very happy to have, speaking as a Liberal. I think the Conservative Party, though, I remember the days of Bill Davis. He regularly met and courted with public sector workers and supported public sector services, and it was something that they wore very proudly. And that's been a change over a long period of time.
Union members voted.
Not only voted, they contributed. They financially they were campaign workers. Teachers were some of the most staunch Conservative supporters that you would find in the province. And then, happily for me, there was seeming 180 degrees and an attack on education and teachers. And I can't tell you the number of riding presidents that I have who were teachers, party workers in Don Valley East who were teachers, contributors who were teachers, and they were all former Conservative supporters.
Richard, does the PC party have to stop seeming like it hates unionized workers so much?
Absolutely. And I think, again, some of it people come this way and come about this with good intentions. They are sort of, it's a backlash almost as what they see as the excesses on this side, but with the Liberals and the NDP. And so they think that there is a natural inclination for government to expand too big and to get involved in too many things and to be expansive. And so it ends up coming across as then hating government. And I agree with Rod 100%. You can't, government can be a force for good. How can you make a case to govern a province with a provincial budget that is 70% dedicated towards healthcare and education? Like, quite frankly, that is a huge part of the mandate of the Ontario government, is to manage healthcare and education. And I can't tell you what a constructive part of our healthcare and education platform have been for quite some time as an Ontario progressive conservative. So this is a big problem. But again, we come at it because we see things like the FIT program and the debacles and energy and other things that we've seen where government intervention has really caused huge problems for the people of Ontario and put us in a huge fiscal mess. And yet our response it ends up being something so over the top, like cutting 100,000 public sector workers and what's seen as an attack on teachers and so on and so forth.
Just curious about that 100,000 workers, because it was such a big part of the explanation, I think, why the PCs lost the last election. You were running for the party in the last election. Did you have a hand in that 100,000 worker cut as a nominated candidate? Were you involved in that at all?
No, it's kind of a complicated answer. We didn't discuss the 100,000 as a caucus or super caucus or in policy meetings. I was actually one of the people that was given a copy, I think 18 months before, of a draft platform and invited to review it and provide feedback.
Was that in that platform?
It was apparently in the platform, but I only got a couple pages in before it was taken away from me. My time was up. So I never actually got to that page.
What?
I had 10 minutes, and I'm a lawyer, so it took me a long time to go through it as I would go through it. So I got to page 2 or something. So I never got that far.
And then they took it away.
That's right.
They took it away from me. So it wasn't really, it was kind of a meaningless review in a sense, because they weren't obviously looking for my feedback if they didn't let me read it.
So you didn't see the 100,000 reference?
I did not see the 100,000 reference, which was buried somewhere down. It was a 20-page document, so not something I could review, you know, in a good way in 10 minutes, frankly. But I want to go back to the other point, because I think most people are frustrated with government, not just most Conservatives. So not to be anti-government, I don't think we should be anti-government. And I think our rhetoric has been about small government versus big government, et cetera. And I think that rhetoric is kind of tired and needs to change, because people don't understand what small government should be or what big government should be against what measure. And I think the issue that most people agree on is that government does not function well. We keep giving our democracy more and more things to do. We're overloading it. And voters are furious because the more we give it to do, the more things it does badly. And so that there is a lot of resonance to that idea, I think, amongst people. So it isn't really an anti-government thing, except there's a frustration with government. It is not working well. And so I think what we should be focusing on, and our new leaders should be focusing on, they should have the vision to be talking about this in a different way.
Let me pick up on that, because you do lead us nicely to the question of the next leader. And I'm frankly less interested in whom all of you think that should be, and more interested in what qualities you think that next leader has to have. I want to start with you, actually, Rod, because you kicked the tires on this thing. You considered, well, I should ask you, how seriously did you consider it?
Friends and people who I'd known for some time and certainly respected suggested it, and I think that happens a lot at the beginning of these processes. People cast a lot of nets out, and so as Richard said, I took the time to travel around and go to some of the meetings that were happening, and learned a lot and really reconnected in the party in a great way. As it turned out, I decided I had a couple other things I was doing that were also important to do. But
buying up other newspapers, for example.
For example, but to the question of what does that leader need to think about, I'm really a believer that we have to re-engage this issue of Toronto, of the larger cities across the province, of the city region that is the Greater Toronto, Hamilton area, and think about what you need to do to be relevant there. And I know there's some folks that are focusing on that particularly, and I think that's
they're going to be on right after you.
I think that's a great thing, because I think it's not that, you know, in some of these condo towers that I go by on my way to work, you know, there's, you know, the same as a small town or two small towns, and we don't necessarily, as a party, we haven't necessarily as a party appreciated what the impact of that is. And I think, you know, the municipal election, we don't know where that's going to end up, but we know that two of the front candidates and the front candidate are people who come from the progressive conservative background. So we can no longer say, well, we're just not electable here. And I think you talk about Tory Toronto in the day. I mean, it's not that long ago. So the future has to include the whole province, but if the future doesn't include relevance, and I'm going to focus particularly on that Greater Toronto area, then there isn't much of a future at all. And so I believe there's a future, and I believe the leader, one of the things that the successful leader, he or she, will do is articulate and understand those issues. And I think there are some candidates that are trying to do that, and that's great.
Richard, what qualities does the next leader have to have?
Well, I think, again, I would look at it from the two dimensions. On the one, the internal side, where I said I think they need to be able to unify the party as it exists. On the other hand, I think there's an opportunity. As Mayor pointed out, we've got this leadership race going on. Our process is quite open, so members of the public can go to OntarioPC.com and buy a membership right online, and they can participate and help us select our next leader.
How much is it?
It's $10.
$10, and the vote is in May.
That's right. You have to be a member by the end of January, and you'll be able to vote on May 3rd and 7th for an announcement on May 9th. So, there, I think that's where it's up to the leadership candidates to articulate a new vision that the Ontario PC party is going to bring forward. It's going to bring forward first internally and through the policy development process so that members feel included and there's buy-in and we can all go out in a unified way and help sell that vision. But ultimately, it's got to be a vision that's inspired by the leadership candidates and what they want to go out and sell to the people of Ontario, and a new vision to bring forward. And I think that's a really crucial quality for that candidate to be able to do that. David?
A couple of things. Certainly, electing or having some kind of an urban vision will be important. But I think the candidates, the Conservative Party, as I understand it, has a very grassroots method to supporting and nominating their candidates. Other parties have taken a far more active role in recruiting and finding individuals. I really do think that will be the indication that they're ready to step up to the next level when they are actively and engaging people who wouldn't otherwise and ordinarily be involved in these kind of things, people who've previously done it, other politicians from other levels, that kind of thing, and building the team that you're going to need in order to say, we're ready to lead this province.
Forgive me, but we do that. I mean, we do go out and candidate search, and we do try and recruit people from the private and other parts of the public sector and so on. But ultimately, we do, on the other hand, and maybe different from other parties, we do say you're still going to have to run in a local nomination and win the support of members in your association. That's something I don't think members would support changing at all. There's got to be a balance there between finding people, good, solid people to come forward and run, but ultimately we're not going to pick anyone who's above submitting themselves to a democratic process of members. So.
I'm not suggesting that you shouldn't. What I am suggesting is that it's going to take building the team of people, I think, that is going to attract the volunteers and the supporters at a local level. And with all due respect to the leaders, you haven't, in my opinion, had the strength of candidates to be able to carry that additional 5 or 10% in ridings and win some of those close races.
I think it goes beyond picking the right candidates. I mean, that's part of it. But more immediately, it's reaching out and expanding your membership. Because again, I'm not a conservative, it's not my party, but from the outside, it seemed to me like the folks that have been in power to some extent lately have been appealing to a kind of smaller slice of the what the Conservative Party membership could be in this province. And we always use the analogy, compare it to the Tea Party in the United States, right? So broaden that out. Hopefully in this race there will be some candidates for leadership that are a bit more moderate, that are going to be progressive conservatives who can expand that membership and reach out and sign those people up. And I have to say, I'm hoping this works because I really believe that the last election didn't serve us well either. And it certainly hasn't served us well to have such extremes.
Us meaning the New Democrats.
The New Democrats. I would much prefer to see a Conservative Party that isn't out there making scary pronouncements. I would like to see a more moderate Conservative Party, clearly, and I think it would be good for Ontario. It would be good for how people feel about politics and government, because it would be less divisive. However, I'm not going to put my money on the moderates unless there's an ability to actually sign up more members and broaden that party base.
Let me try this. We have 2 female party leaders in Ontario right now. Robin, would it be an advantage to the Conservatives to have a female leader as well, or not?
I wouldn't say just because of gender alone it would be an advantage. I think the number one quality that we should be looking for in our new leader is that they are a good communicator. And we need someone who is able to connect with people, who is willing to listen to people, who cares about their lives and is willing to pay attention, when talking to people about what is impacting people. And as Marit said, to reach out and sign up people who haven't been members before. In fact, I think we should be doing that as a party right now, not just through the leadership candidates. It's a great opportunity right now to say to people, we want your help to rebuild this party. Come and tell us what you think we should be doing. We need to reach out to people, and now is an opportunity not just for their vote for the leader, but this is a great time to get involved.
We should say, you're not, if in answering this question, you're not necessarily tipping your hand as to who you want, because there are 2 female candidates in the race.
Right.
There will be 3 male candidates in the race.
Right.
So, David, does it advantage the Conservatives to also have a female leader as the other 2 parties do?
No, I don't think it makes a difference one way or the other. I think Robin's right. Whoever is a strong communicator, whoever can capture Conservative values, turn those into what is relevant to Ontario voters, I think those are the most important qualities. I don't know Mr. Brown, but I do know
Patrick Brown from Barrie.
But I do know the other 4, and think quite highly of all 4 of the ones that I'd known as colleagues, and they all bring different qualities and different strengths, and I'm sure would serve the party quite well. I think that sometimes you'll get pundits who will say, now is time for a woman, or now is time for a person from Northern Ontario, or and pronouncements like that. But I don't think that the rank and file of the party or the broad, expansive Ontario would look at things that way.
Well, let's try this. Richard, in the last Liberal leadership contest, which Kathleen Wynne won in January of 2013, you had a Portuguese Canadian in that race, you had a Sikh Canadian in that race, you had an Italian Canadian in that race. I'm not making a value judgment here, but the PC campaign is going to have a McLeod, a Brown, an Elliott, it's going to have a McNaughton. There'll be one candidate with a vowel at the end of his name in Vic Fideli.
You have a president who has a vowel at the end of their name.
And the president too.
Yeah.
Does any of that matter? Does that send a signal?
I really don't think so. I really hope the last thing members or anybody else would be looking at in this leadership race would be gender, or whether they have a vowel or not at the end of their last name or anything of the kind. I really think it is about having an inspiring leader who's going to bring forward a new direction, a new vision for Ontario.
I hear you, but at that Liberal convention, when all of those candidates were on the stage, and you saw how different they all looked from each other,
right,
it did send a kind of a signal that said, we do kind of represent all of the colors in the rainbow of Ontario in a way the PC party won't.
As does the caucus. I mean, look at the caucuses, and part of that is
ours is much smaller.
and that's fair.
Yeah.
And we don't have the urban vote.
And again, we have men and women running, and people of diverse background, and educational and business and public sector and private sector and so on. So
people can still put themselves forward as leadership candidates. It's not cut off until January.
The end of January.
So there may be some people who step forward who,
you expecting somebody that we don't know about yet?
I'm just saying. We
Richard,
don't know.
you expecting somebody we don't know?
We don't know.
We'll see.
Rod, how about that?
I think that the party, as I said, does not reflect the province in the way that it did when it was successful. And to the extent the Liberal Party has had considerable success, to the extent the Federal Conservative Party has success, it has managed to reach out and reflect, and the only, Stephen Harper doesn't have a vowel at the end of his name either, but that party reflects Canada, and therefore, so I think it is a necessary precondition to be successful. I think this process brings in new people, and I think that is the opportunity. And the fact of, I think every one of the leadership candidates, I've had the chance to speak to all of them, believe in that, understand that, and want to see that, and we'll see who's the best at it.
I mean, on the subject of gender, I think we've finally hit this moment where it doesn't seem to matter, and I love it, and it's great. But in terms of the diversity, I do think it would benefit the Conservative Party enormously to have, in terms of what we were talking about earlier, of being able to reach out and broaden your base, to have a little bit more diversity in the leadership race. I know you can't control that, who decides to enter the race, but I'm sure, I would assume that the Conservative Party is actually interested in finding candidates potentially for the leadership who are more representative of our province as it exists today.
I should ask it. Are you, as the president, out there beating the bushes trying to find more and more people to run?
Well, yes, I am. I'm interested in having a good, big field of candidates for leader, just as I am interested in having a big, full field of candidates for nominations. That's part of our role, is to try and attract people into those races and give the members as many options as possible.
Gotcha. That's our time, friends. Thanks so much for coming into our studios here in Leaside and helping us out with this discussion. Great to have all of you aboard on TVO tonight.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.